Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. My name is Safir Ahmad, and it is my distinct honor to welcome all of you tonight on behalf of Zaytuna College. I want to welcome all of you who are sitting here in this hall, but also hundreds of you who are joining us online from across the country and across the globe. So we have two audiences, one in-house and one online. We will begin tonight's program with a Quran recitation in Arabic, followed by the reading of the English translation. And this will be done by Abdullah Ahmad, and he is a freshman at Zaytuna College. Please welcome Abdullah Ahmad.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والنجم إذا هوى ما ضل صاحبكم وما غوى وما ينطق عن الهوى إن هو إلا وحي يوحى علمه شديد القوى ذو مرة فاستوى وهو بالأفق الأعلى ثم دنا فتدلى فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى فأوحى إلى عبده ما أوحى ما كذب الفؤاد ما رأى أفتمارونه على ما يرى ولقد رآه نزلة أخرى عند سدرة المنتهى عندها جنة المأوى إذ يغشى السدرة ما يغشى ما زاغ البصر وما طغى لقد رأى من آيات ربه الكبرى. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. By the star, when it sets, your companion has neither strayed nor erred, nor does he speak out of caprice. It is not but a revelation revealed, taught him by one of awesome power. Possessed of vigor, he stood upright when he was upon the highest horizon. Then he drew nigh and came close, till he was within 2 bows' length, or nearer. Then he revealed to his servant what he revealed. The heart lied not in what it saw. Do you then dispute with him as to what he saw? And indeed, he saw him another time, at the lote tree of the boundary, by which lies the garden of the refuge, when there covered the lote tree that which covered. The gaze swerved not, nor did it transgress. Indeed, he saw the greatest of the signs of his Lord. Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Thank you, Abdullah. Before we begin our program for tonight, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements, and then I will introduce the speaker, and then we'll begin the program, inshallah. The announcement is that some of you may have noticed when you came in that we have a lovely new bookstore across the hall outside. It's an unusual bookstore in the sense that all the books that are in there were hand-selected by Zaytuna scholars. And it also has, in addition to that, a lot of books that are part of the reading material for students at Zaytuna College as well. And there are also some other beautiful gifts for those family and friends that you want to give gifts to. So the bookstore will be open after the program itself. Till about 9:30 or so, it'll be open. So if you want to browse through, please take a minute to do that. That's the end of my commercial. Actually, it's a public service announcement. It's a PSA, not a commercial. We are a not-for-profit organization. And for those who did not get a chance to buy the book that is being launched tonight, that book will also be available outside at the bookstore. And Dr. Hatem Bazian, our speaker tonight, will be available to sign that book before. So you can buy the copy, sign it on your way out. You can get it signed. Now on to tonight's program. The subject of the book that is being launched, Palestine, is an important one for all of us across the world, but I would posit that it's particularly important for American citizens given the role of the United States in what's happening and what's taking place in that region. And given the results of the recent election and given the new administration that is about to occupy the executive branch of the United States, it's anybody's guess what impact that will have on the Middle East and on the people of Palestine. So tonight, let us all try to better understand the roots and the historical context of how we got here, how it got to be the conditions that we see in Palestine. And we have no better guide for that understanding than our main speaker tonight, Dr. Hatem Bazian, the author of the book that is being launched. The title of the book is Palestine, It is Something Colonial. Tonight's program will have a simple format. First, we will hear from our main speaker, Dr. Hatem Bazian, and after that, after his talk and his presentation, he will be joined on stage by Dr. Stephen Small of UC Berkeley, and they will engage in a brief conversation right here on the stage, and after that, we will take some questions from the audience in the room, as well as questions from people who are watching this program online. So if you have any questions, hang on to them, and hopefully there'll be time for a few questions later. So let me first introduce Dr. Stephen Small, and then I will introduce Dr. Hatem. Stephen Small is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He has taught in the Department of Sociology at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and in the Center for Research in Ethnic Relations at the University of Leicester, at the University of Warwick, and in the Department of Sociology at the University of Leicester. His research is organized around the social scientific analysis of contemporary racial formations, and it addresses links between historical structures and contemporary manifestations of racial formations, both in the United States and elsewhere in the African diaspora. Now to our main speaker. Dr. Hatem Bazian is co-founder of Zaytuna College, and he also serves as a faculty member and serves on the board of trustees of this college. He also is a senior lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Bazian founded the Center for the Study of Documentation of Islamophobia at UC Berkeley in 2009. And he also launched the Islamophobia Studies Journal through a collaborative effort with a number of academic institutions, and that took place in 2012. He's also on the board of the Islamic Scholarship Fund. Perhaps more relevant for tonight's program and the topic that we're dealing with, he is the founding president of American Muslims for Palestine, which is an educational and grassroots organization. Lastly, when it comes to all things Palestine, Dr. Hatem Bazian is a virtual walking encyclopedia on the subject. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Hatem Bazian.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome for friends, colleagues, old friends, and also mentors. I'd like first to actually express my thanks for Professor Algar, who's here with us. Professor Algar, for all those who possibly don't know, was my thesis advisor and was my professor at UC Berkeley. He is retired right now, but I'm really very thankful for him because he actually supervised my thesis on Jerusalem and Islamic consciousness. So I'm constantly in gratitude for the work and for his contribution. What I would like to begin with is to draw your attention to the image that's on the screen as the first foray into the discussion of this book. What you have in here is the image of my own father's passport, which is a British passport. Now, while visiting my mother, who was recovering from a major operation in Jordan, I took the time to go through family photos and documents. And aside from the usual collections of early childhood photos and funny faces at events, my late dad's Palestinian passport from British Mandate period took up most of my time, as it was preserved in an excellent condition and had many stamps and travel details on it. Now, during my childhood years and while growing up, I had seen and held and examined the passport before, but this time I was approaching it as a historian, constantly writing on settler colonialism, on Palestine, on Palestine's history, Zionism, and the constant attempt for erasure of everything relating to Palestine. The passport is an important family possession, as well as being a piece of history, verifying in distinct colonial ways Palestine's presence on the map before the ongoing Zionist erasure. Issued to my father in 1943, it is a British passport bearing the number 169390, which is then designated for the Mandate of Palestine. Now, as we often deal with the Palestine issue, often the history begins in many of those who are dealing with it, begin either with 1948, or those who are a little bit more crafty will actually only look at 1967 and only speak of the occupation. The passport, maps, currencies, and all the colonial documents use Palestine, including, interestingly enough, the British Zionist discussions before, during, and after World War I. Likewise, the name Palestine was used during the late Ottoman period. The area's indigenous populations used the land's name, major cities, towns, as points of reference for their identity. However, this did not mean that they somehow failed to identify with and conceptualize Palestine as their cohesive homeland. Zionism involved erasing existing Palestinian history and forging a new history so as to claim the land and expel the population. So the foray in Palestine, it's something colonial. It is to actually shift and decenter the discussion only about occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, and to begin to actually have a longer examination of Palestinian history. Palestine was not occupied in 1948, contrary to popular belief. It actually was occupied and colonized to begin with by the British. The British entered into Palestine either on December 9th or December 10th, 1917. So it will be incorrect to say that Palestine colonization only began in 1947-48 as a result of the Nakba. One can actually assert that a longer history for Palestine can be asserted, going as back as the early part of the 19th century, as the British, French, and other European powers began to consider how to dismantle the Ottomans. I have a whole chapter that deals with the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman state and to carve it out for various European powers. It is not surprising that today's conflict in what we call the Middle East, and I still don't know where the middle of the Middle East is, it's a reference itself colonial, because it's a reference in relations to Europe, declaring and crafting the parts of the world in relations to proximity to Great Britain, which I may say no longer is great, nor whatever was great, because that title only belongs to the divine. The British and the French machinations, specifically in relations to the Ottomans, can be very well documented throughout the 19th century, if not before. This culminating in what we call today is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And we're in this year and in the following year are recognizing two important 100-year anniversary. One is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, an agreement between the French and the British to carve out the remnants or whatever was left of the Ottoman state and creating what we call today the modern nation state. It's called Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, and also, interestingly enough, the present-day Saudi Arabia and the states that are surrounding the region. So in essence, the crafting of the present boundaries in the area that we call, quote, the Middle East, originates from the attempt to dismember the Ottoman state, and including in this dismemberment the second piece of British machination, which is the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration, issued on November 2nd, 1917, by the British, and promising the World Zionist Organization, and written as a document that is forwarded to the World Zionist Organization, promising Palestine as a homeland to the Jewish people. At the time of its issuing, again, November 2nd, 1917, the British had no control over Palestine. We said that Palestine was occupied and colonized by the British beginning on December 9th or December 10th, when General Allenby took over possession of Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, upon his entry to Jerusalem and receiving the surrender of the city, he stated, quote, the Crusades come to an end in this sense. And British officers, as well as British discourses at the time, used the Crusades, and no less than 5 books actually framed the British arrival into Palestine as culminating or bringing the Crusades to an end. It is not surprising that, moving forward and tangential, when George Bush mistakenly said, and possibly maybe rightly said, that we are on a crusade, he had to immediately change the language, and his PR handlers had to arrange for him a morning meeting in the mosque to indicate that he is not actually engaging in a crusade. That was immediately after 9/11. The British issuing of the Balfour Declaration, contrary to popular opinion and contrary to some of the discussion, it was not in favor or in rewarding the Jewish population. If anything, the debate around the Balfour Declaration was filled with anti-Semitic discourses. In London and in England at the time, in the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, anti-Semitism was running rampant. And the British actually wanted to hit 2 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, they could actually manage to remove the Jewish population that was increasing in number as a result of migration from Eastern Europe, and having many of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe experiencing pogroms, that increasing numbers of Jews in England resulted in the British thinking strategically of how to get rid of the Jewish population, and therefore what we have is the Jewish question. Now let me step aside and say, anytime that you have somebody framing any type of ethnic, religious community as the Jewish question, then that is a racialized structure that has to be challenged. And the question, quote, the Jewish question is actually should be seen as the European question or the European problem. And Europe have constantly had a problem living with the other. It's not the other that is the problem. And I think today we have the Muslim question in France, the Muslim question in England, and with our new election, we have the Muslim question in the United States. That all these discourses is a racialized discourses that have to be challenged. The British, in thinking and in issuing the Balfour Declaration, had their own strategic consideration. One is to remove the Jewish population, but second, which is more importantly, and we see this in the debate, in the ministerial meetings, that the discussion was about creating a buffer state to secure British colonial possession in Egypt, opposite India, where in the northern part of India there was a mountainous terrain that provided natural protection and boundaries, while Palestine would be a buffer state to protect Egypt. Recalling again, Egypt is the major colonial possession of Britain in 1882, coming under direct colonization, and India likewise being a colonial possession. India and the British control of India, we had the Great Game, which pitted the British against the Russians in a prolonged contestation and conflict over that region, including Afghanistan, which was at the center of the Great Game. Palestine was a strategic buffer state that could secure the British colonial possession in Egypt and also secure the trade routes that moved products and resources throughout this strategic juncture between Africa, Asia, the Mediterranean, as well as the Red Sea. At no time was a consideration of the British that they were undertaking the Balfour Declaration out of love or concern or any type of Judeo-Christian tradition. This notion of Judeo-Christian tradition is only a most recent development, and if you actually talk possibly or discuss of some of the Jewish populations from the Middle Ages or from the period of the Spain in 1492 and tell them there is such a notion of Judeo-Christian tradition, they will be rolling in their grave so fast that they will generate an alternative energy source for the world. It'll be more accurate to say that there is an Islamic Jewish historical tradition, and the Christian Judaic tradition actually would have to be challenged on a number of counts, recalling 1492 and the expulsion of both Muslims and Jews. And we could go throughout the many pogroms that occurred throughout Europe, Eastern Europe as well, and then not to actually forget the Holocaust itself has to constantly be remembered as a European phenomena, and in particular also is part of the normative practices of Europe rather than the exception. So the British were thinking from a colonial perspective themselves. Simultaneously, the British were engaged in the Arabian Peninsula. Today, we have a debate about the concept of Khilafah or Khalifa. In correspondence between the British and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, these correspondence, actually, Sharif Hussein of Mecca sought the British assurance that they will declare him as a Khalifa for the territories that will be secured from the Ottoman state. And sure enough, actually, the British have assured Sharif Hussein that in case or after the conclusion of the First World War, that the British will recognize Sharif Hussein as a Khalifa. Maybe some of those Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula, as well as those who are in England, might call on the British to actually fulfill their promise of declaring a Khalifa. Not the one that is Baghdadi, but the one that the British actually secured in their idea of fragmentation and also leading a revolt against the British. This is what came to be known in 20th century history as the Great Arab Revolt. For those who don't know, the Great Arab Revolt was not great, nor was it Arab. The Great Arab Revolt, quote, was a British intelligence operation also carried out by T.E. Lawrence, and I also insist of not calling him T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, because to belong to Arabia is an honor, and T.E. Lawrence of 10 Downing Street, an intelligence officer that crossed the Arab world in order to foment a revolt against the Ottoman, should not be honored with such a title that belongs to prophets, that belong to the Quran, and to belong to a magnanimous language as such. So again, the Great Arab Revolt was instrumentalized by the British for a specific purpose as well. During the First World War, and again, we are on almost the 100th-year anniversary of the First World War, the British and the French armies, but in here I'm concerned about the British, had many Muslim troops that were recruited to fight in the ranks of the British Army. These troops were predominantly coming from the Indian subcontinent, as well as from parts of Africa that were colonized, and a considerable part of those troops were Muslim troops themselves. The British needed some cover, for an Islamic cover, in order for these troops actually to fight against the Ottomans. And what better than Sharif Hussein, a descendant of the Prophet, to launch a revolt against the Ottoman and delegitimize their role as being the leaders or the effective leaders of the Muslim world. As such, the instrumentalization and pushing for the Great Arab Revolt, again, was not for the love of Arabs, nor was it for any other purpose other than dividing and conquering and making sure that such a revolt will disrupt the transportation of the Ottoman army in the Jordan, throughout the Hijaz railroad line? And sure enough, Sharif Hussein's revolt against the Ottoman managed to disrupt the railroad track and the supply route, which allowed the British to land unmolested on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast, and also come out of Egypt to conquer Palestine and Jordan. Today, what we see in the present framing is the consequences of the British fomenting the revolt against the Ottoman and causes this collapse. And then within the British framing, we get the incubation of Zionism. So Zionism has to be understood. It was incubated by the British as a consequence pre and post First World War. And the Zionists themselves, actually in articulating their goals and in their project, they articulated as to be a colonial project. Now, I know some contemporary pro-Israel speakers and pro-Israel advocates will often challenge and wants to clean up Israel history by not wanting to engage in the language or using the language of colonialism and settler colonialism. Zionism and pro-Zionists define Zionism as a Jewish liberation movement. Right? Zionism as a Jewish liberation movement. Now, this framing would have been correct had the Jewish liberation movement, as it relates to Zionism, liberated parts of Europe that was engaged in anti-Semitic discourses toward the Jewish population. But one cannot have a liberation movement that is in partnership with the colonial powers and then seek to dispossess and supplant a population that had historically had no role in any type of antagonism or anti-Semitic discourses relative to the Jewish population. And in here, I'm not whitewashing or making a very clean history. Relations between Muslims and Jews had periods of tension. They had periods where there were intercommunal conflicts. We could mention situations occurring in Damascus, situations occurring in Yemen, situations occurring in Baghdad, in North Africa. But we do not have any evidence whatsoever of any type of violence and systematic state violence directed at Jewish population because of them being Jewish. And that is evidence that could be studied and looked upon from the early formative period of Islam all the way up to the present. More importantly, the history of refuge that was given to the Jewish population from Europe to various parts of the Muslim world illustrates that relationship that existed for the longest period of time. And I think it's important to emphasize this. The Zionist movement saw itself as a reformist movement away from traditional Judaism. Zionism saw itself as a reformist movement away from traditional Judaism, to break away from the hold of rabbinical Judaism and to emerge into modernity by embracing nationalism that is founded upon bloodline, and to embrace territoriality, in essence saying that there has to be a matrimony between the new Jewish person that is emerging into modernity and the land of Palestine, since reconfiguring and imagining history where Jewish people and the land were one in the David's period as well as the periods of the prophet, and to imagine the way to enter back into modernity by taking over the Palestine as a land and bring Jews back into history. So for Zionism, entry into history was by necessity. They had to dispossess the Palestinian population in order for them to enter into history by means of this dispossession. So Zionism, as far as the concept of a national liberation movement, fails to actually engage in liberation movement in areas where the Jews actually were living, whether it be in England, France, Germany, or Eastern Europe. They sought partnership and got wedded to be the junior partner of a colonial project that was already almost 200 years in the making by European powers. In this sense, one has to challenge the basic framing of what Zionism is. Zionism is a settler-colonial project that accepted the basic epistemic of European colonization and emerges out of European nationalism and wanting to project itself and accepting and surrendering to anti-Semitism. So aside from how Israel today calls itself as being the refuge, and it might be the refuge of the Jewish people tangentially, but in essence, it's a surrender to the power of anti-Semitism in Europe, and it did not defeat anti-Semitism nor challenge it. It actually accepted to be a partner in Palestine and actually engaging in the disposition of the Palestinians. I'm not going to go through a chronological historical treatment. The book is not a chronological treatment of Palestine, it's thematic. And therefore, part of it is how to situate Palestine as a settler-colonial project. There is a distinction between colonialism and settler-colonialism. There's a distinction between colonialism and settler-colonialism. The British were colonialist in the sense that their project, there was a colonial motherland that conquered and took over vast territories across the globe, and to seek the resources, natural resources, raw material, also to seek the employment and take over the labor force on those colonies, and facilitate the removal of natural resources, then taking them to the colonial motherland to process them for finished products, and then send them back to be sold in the colonies, controlling the economy, the politics, and so on. So that's colonialism. The British were the masters at it. If you looked at the world map in 1914, 85% of the Earth's surface was a colony, either colonized by the British, by the French, by the Portuguese, by the Dutch, by the Spanish, by the Italians and Germans. That's 85%. On a tangential note, in terms of the British, it was said that the British were an empire that the sun never sat upon. And in essence, one of the jokes says, why the sun never sat on the British Empire? He says, because God doesn't trust them in the dark. But today, again, that the British have no sun left because many of their colonial possessions, rightly so, has gained its independence and freedom. But Palestine was the last colonial project to be commissioned in the 20th century at a time where colonization as a project was coming to an end. And as such, we have to really understand what is the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a colonial structure that seeks to take over the land, does not have a use for the population, so most often the population is committed to genocide, and you don't need to conceptualize far. America has the most successful settler colonial project because the native population have been completely decimated through a structure of genocide, which also opened the door for the importation of African slaves to be the labor force, because the native population, on the one hand, they were committed to genocide, as well as they were resisting actually being put to work for the settler colonial enterprise. Another reminder of history that the first slave trade actually was Native American slaves that were taken to Europe in the second journey of Columbus. So we have a long array in relations to settler colonialism, and the Americas are the most successful settler colonial program that committed the population to genocide, or in other situations like early South Africa, a settler colonial project that at a certain point was connected to a motherland and engaged in transferring the population from one side to the other in concentrating the black South Africans in the homelands. Settler colonialism, again, takes the land, claims it, and expels the population in there. Zionism approached Palestine as a settler colonial project. From the inception, they wanted to dispossess and remove the Palestinians. Theodor Herzl himself actually contemplated from early on to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in transit country. This gets us into one of the most atrocious claims that are forwarded in relations to Palestine and the Zionists, in a sense saying Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. A land without a people for a people without a land. Actually, just last week there was a post on Facebook that said if Palestine was a land without a people, then how do we account for the claim of the Zionists that there's a long Jewish history in the land? So if Palestine is actually, as you state, as you assert, was a land without a people, so how do you claim that there was 1,000 years of continuous Jewish existence and having a state of antiquity present in there? And as such, that claim, again, was forwarded, which is normative in settler-colonial discourse. We use it in here, in the Americas, that the land is empty. And as such, there was no population. All the references from early Zionist discourses and all early Zionist writing shows that Palestine was heavily populated. And in some references, it says that there isn't an inch except that is heavily cultivated and contested in relations to Palestine. More importantly, if anyone just uses the biblical narrative as a historical text, the reference to Palestine as the land of milk and honey, and I know from the early period of the biblical text up to the 20th century, there was no nuclear device or bomb that erased the population. So what made it from time immemorial, the land of milk and honey, to the early 20th century, that it becomes the land without a people, for a people without a land? So that claim, again, is asserted as a way to strip the indigenous populations of their right. The second claim that often is also forwarded is to say that they made the desert bloom. That's another aspect of colonial discourses, settler-colonial discourses, that the native population don't know the value of their land. They don't even have the ingenious ways and methods to cultivate and bring it into fruition and make it the land that is giving bountiful of vegetations and so on. So that claim on the Palestinian, again, is normative of settler-colonial discourses. And again, the references in history is very well established. Not only we have the Ottoman long records of taxation, of zakat collection from Palestine and the Syrian Peninsula. And anyone who wants to do research, actually what in Istanbul you go to the daftars, which is these records that are kept by the Ottomans, that recorded almost to the minute details. If anything, the Ottomans were meticulous in record keeping, and more so when it comes to taxation, better than our IRS in relations to the tax structure. A similar collection also exists in the Sharia court in Beirut. So you could actually go to the Sharia court in Beirut and then also the Sharia court in Damascus, but we don't know what the court records or the archives in Damascus at this point, considering the calamities that have befallen and the ongoing civil war that have possibly caused the damage and loss of considerable material. So this notion that Palestine was not cultivated and it was not bearing fruit can be challenged on the Ottoman archives. It also could be challenged with the British archives during the Mandate from 1917 onward. But when the Mandate authority was granted to the British, we have a whole set of records of taxation, of collection, as well as the collection of awqaf, which is the revenues from the religious endowment that the British actually has forwarded. So that's another main concept, main idea that settler colonialism forwards, which in essence saying that the indigenous population don't have value, don't value the land. Or as we often hear in America, that they don't have the same identification or same conceptualization of private property. This is how we took the lands of the Native Americans, including right now the whole debate about Standing Rock. The fact they know or not, the fact whether they share or don't share our understanding of property right does not give you the right to have wholesale theft of their property. Right? This notion of a group of people that are stripped of their right to their ancestral land because they have a communal relationship to the land was used often in the Americas as well as in colonial possession, in colonial project, as a way to strip indigenous populations of their land. The third claim that is also forwarded by the settler-colonialist in relation to the Zionist project is that the Palestinians did not have a state. Did not have a state, and again, in here they navigate the historical text of the Bible, of the ancient emergence of the state of Israel of the ancient time. And in here, whenever we use the state of Israel of ancient time, we have to problematize this, because you cannot lift up anything from history and use it as the pretext to actually compare to the emergence of modern nation state of today. Modern nation state of today are completely different conceptualization than the ancient polities that existed in 1000 BC or even further than that. What is essentially is asserting that the Palestinians did not have a conceptualization of their national identity in the modern sense. And then the more insulting and pernicious claim that the Palestinians only learned their national identity by actually learning it and having relations with the emerging Zionist population, and therefore, in essence, you don't have an authenticity of who you are. That is a much more insidious claim, because at the foundation, every human being is endowed the capacity to know thyself and to be able to conceptualize their relationship to their ancestral land and where they exist. Whether they had a parliament like Switzerland or Germany is secondary, is not the basis of having claim to your territory and claim to your culture, tradition, history, and so on. So that you see it time and time again. You don't need to go far. Actually, some of our own universities actually will put out books and materials having, politics of the Middle East, politics of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and basically reproduce and constantly enter into the conversation and settler-colonial framing of the Palestine history and the Palestine context, in essence reproducing a Zionist claiming relative to Palestine. So that's another aspect of settler colonialism, and we see it in this. The last piece, and I don't want to go much more because I think we're going to have a conversation with Stephen Small, because again, I said if he doesn't come to the conversation, I have a whole book, so it's 300 some pages, so I could lecture from now until next Ramadan, right, if you have the time. But one of the issues that I want to focus on is the whole theology of dispossession, or the biblical theology of dispossession. Both the Zionists as well as their allies in the Christian right have utilized the biblical text as a tool to actually engage in settler colonialism and a structure of dispossession. We know this during the colonial period in Africa, all right, using, again, manifest destiny, white man burden, and all this discourse relative to legitimization by means of religious texts. In here, colonization and colonial discourses have internalized or taken the voice of God in order to actually give veracity for an imperial project and a settler colonial project. Let us be very clear, there is nothing divine in the articulation of Zionism in Palestine. God has nothing to do with the Zionist project, no matter what and how many rabbinical statements or texts are cited as evidence. And therefore, this is a humanly constructed project in partnership with an imperial power, Great Britain, and its success, and then its inheritor of its power and authority, the United States. And anyone that attempts to legitimize it by means of engaging in religious discourse to say that this represents divine purpose has to be challenged on its basis. More importantly, in the United States, among a large segment of the Christian, extreme Christian right, not all Christian, but the extreme Christian right, evangelical and millenarian, as well as rapture theologian, they actually see the creation and the support for the current state of Israel as the stepping stone for the return of Jesus. And the question that has to be posed for the Zionists who have relations with this broad coalition, what will happen when Jesus returns according to these millenarian and rapture theorists? What they don't tell you is that both Jews and Muslims have to be put to the slaughter, and only those who embrace or at least convert to Christianity are to be the one that are rescued. In some estimate, 2/3 of the Jewish population will be killed. In here, you could say that this is a marriage of convenience, or more like a shotgun wedding, as a way to try to bring force and power into the reality of today. So we need to challenge these epistemics that utilize the biblical text, religion, end of time scenario as a means of selling more weapons and actually seeing divine purpose as almost having a worldwide wrestling match with powers that are vested with nuclear weapons that could bring destruction upon the world. It seems interesting that this discourse is having prevalence in the United States, and as the more that we have some economic or social crisis, the more people actually begin to manifest and rotate toward these consideration as a way to support the contemporary development in Israel as it relates to the Palestinians. So we need to challenge what I call the biblical theology of dispossession that uses the Bible as a source to dispossess population, in particular here in Palestine. The last part of the book, I actually don't offer any comprehensive solution, but I actually enumerate the 6 ways that almost globally everybody approaches Palestine. The 2 prominent aspects of it in relation to the 6 is the 2-state solution, which if you watched AIPAC's website after Trump's election, the 2-state framing is already removed from AIPAC's website. We already know that Netanyahu and his government and some of the ministers in there have already been celebrating because there will not be any type of pressure from the United States. This is even conceptualizing if the United States even had the ability or had the temerity to put pressure on Netanyahu, and every time that the United States even wanted to ask for a 1-month freeze of settlement, not to stop settlement, 1-month freeze, the United States government was unable to. And on a number of occasions when our Vice President Biden visited Palestine, the Israelis actually welcomed him with a new settlement. And when the Secretary of State likewise visited the country, they welcomed him with another settlement, essentially saying that we're not going to really listen to any type of pressure that comes from the United States. And this is under Obama's administration. The new crop of leaders that are coming with the new administration, from all of the individuals that have been in the circle of power around Trump, it is not a hopeful sign that any type of pressure will be brought about to stop or push the Israelis to change or alter their course. So the 2-state solution, for all intensive purposes, is dead. The Oslo framework has been almost put to the grave many years over. When the Oslo Agreement was started in 1993, there were approximately 130,000 settlers in the West Bank. Now, almost 23 years and counting of the Oslo Agreement, there's 580,000 settlers that have moved into the West Bank, all supported by our tax money, because we tend to give Israel directly $3 billion a year in cash. And then if you add all the incentives and all the sidekicks, all the tax breaks, the Friends of the Israel Arm, the Friends of the Israel Defense Force, it actually can be possibly up to $7 billion. But again, those are the ways that we support Israel in general. So I don't expect any change to take place, and Israel is devouring the West Bank in its totality. In historical Palestine, approximately 12.6 million people live. Half of them are Jewish and half of them as Palestinians. So can we contemplate a decolonized horizon? And what does a decolonized horizon looks like? Most of our preoccupation and framing is the question about Israel's security. And often this Israel security implies that the problem is Palestinian violence. And I don't have a problem in answering and discussing Palestinian violence and violence in general with somebody who comes from a Gandhian background. But Zionists who come to ask that question are often themselves are vested into and almost are wedded into the structure of violence. And what they want is to problematize the violence of the colonized as the source of instability in the colonization project. What I would say is the following, that Palestinian violence is a byproduct of the settler-colonial project that was set and situated upon them. This is not to excuse or to give any aspect of not challenging Palestinians for their conduct, but the question again is not coming on the framing of nonviolence as a structure, but rather those who are advocating or speaking of Palestinian violence are themselves major supporters of violence, if anything, that they're a part and parcel of it. The more important question is that those who pose the question about Palestinian violence are attempting to ask us Palestinians to solve their imperial colonial problems. And I often say and assert that I am not in here to solve your colonial problem. You created your colonial box and you need to clean it yourself. I'm not gonna be a problem solver for colonial problems or imperial problems in general. For those who have often problems with what I say, I recommend for you to seek a therapist, because what I say, if it bothers you, the problem is in your perception of it rather than in me asserting the reality and the veracity of what the Palestinian cause is all about. We demand, in relations to Palestinians as a conclusion, freedom, dignity, justice, and equality. And no type of oppressive structure will actually get us to deviate from those fundamental demands. We are able to reconcile if the reconciliation is based on sincerity, on decolonized framing, but if it is only a part of PR, like many of those who appeal and approach us, we are struggling and will continue to struggle for generations for those basic freedoms that are due to everyone in humanity. Thank you.
So, Dr. Hatem, I want to start off with a couple of quick questions for you. You drew a distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism.
Yes.
Is one way, would it be proper to say that the consequence of colonialism was exploitation, and the consequence of settler colonialism is displacement? Is that a
That's
framing?
one way we could look at it. Again, colonialism wanted to take raw material, and there's a debate whether the company came first or the army, or they came together in the sense of trying to dominate and take over the vast territories with natural resources and disruption of existing markets and economies, and directing those natural resources to the colonial motherland, and then sending back finished products. And if there's economic development, often giving them downstream economic development. Then another aspect of colonialism is also nurturing an elite or a campadora class that you bring to be educated and taught. So many colonial states that were colonized, we see that their elites were all educated in the colonial motherland, and they were sent back to manage the post-colonial structure. So often when I'm evaluating and looking at the crises that are befallen parts of the world in the southern hemisphere that have experienced colonialism, we're dealing with post-colonialism, which means that the structures that were there in the colonial structure, which had education, politics, economy, even religious structures, all those were colonial structure, and that began to be a prolonged exploitation. Displacement, again, because the displacement for settler colonialism, that the settlers took that this land is theirs, and using all types of rationalization, most powerful of it, again, is the religious discourse that is there, but the racial discourse. Remember that pre-settler colonialism, or even before colonization, they had to theorize about race. And European pure race was constructed to be the pure race, and then those who were deemed to be inferior, subhuman, and therefore if you're subhuman, then you don't even have legitimacy to claim any territory because you're not human. And that, we see it here continued when the United States in relations to African Americans, that they were not considered to be a full person, and I would say in certain corners we still have a long struggle in relations to that. So the displacement that took place is a result of a particular type of epistemic relative to settler colonialists.
And the commonality, as you said, between both colonialism and settler colonialism is also racial factor.
Oh, again, racial factor is infused in colonization and settler colonialism, as well as violence and others. So colonization built its foundation upon otherization and creating a subhuman that legitimizes, on the one hand, taking over their land and their possession, and in the other, also having a mission to civilize. And the mission to civilize, essentially, is to create this inferiority and to create an imitative project in the colonized subject. So I think if you look at Albert Memmi's work on the colonized and the colonizer, it's an important work, or Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, just to understand these are normative structures that are applied relative to the colonized population.
And then to bring that forward, the idea of that analysis that you presented. Thank you.
Thank you.
The analysis that you present, that history, how do you see that showing up? What are the implications of that for what's happening today? How do we apply that analysis of a settler-colonial project to the current state and the current state of the region itself, but particularly the Palestinian people?
Well, I have actually written another, not this, but a series on that, what we're experiencing in the world, rather than to see it that the Syrians are having a conflict, the Central Africans are republic, people are having a conflict, and so on, is actually to look and assert that we're experiencing the collapse of the post-colonial structure that have been put in place for the 20th century. And as a result of a variety of processes, economic, political, social, and so on, and as a result of this collapse, there is an attempt or a resultant factor of this mass movement that is occurring, and the intensification of the violence that is being set in many territories, not only in relations to Palestine, but other places as well. So in thinking of settler colonialism and colonialism in general, is to dispense with us in almost constantly using a racialized lens or an Islamophobic lens or a narrow lens of why these things are happening. So there must be something biological in them. So for me, let's say the clash of civilization is the new form of biological racism, but giving what you call a new garb. Biological racism was discredited as a result of the Second World War, and those who are asserting cultural racism or clash of civilization discourse are using cultural racism as a signpost for biological racism. And I think we see this in relations to Palestine, in relations to the dispossession of the Palestinians, using this type of discourse on a regular basis. The dispossession is occurring regularly. The takeover of land, the building of settlements, the expansion, all this is paradigmatic of the continuation of a settler colonial epistemic that we need to examine it from this perspective. Now, the reason I'm focusing exclusively and insist on this is that every time you get invited to have a discussion, let's get some Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and Zionists together so they basically can solve their differences. Our issue is not that we can't get along. Right? This is not an issue of like we can sit down and have chai latte and discuss. The issue is land rights. The issue is dispossession. The issue is building settlement. The issue is violence, structured violence. These issues are to be discussed. And then a much more sophisticated is let's have a discussion about the text. Our discussion is not that we have a different view or we could examine the religious text from different lenses. The question is that you have a gun over your head with a knife on your back and you're in the grave and somebody says, can we really discuss the theology of how you view God? This has to be a fundamental analysis that we're dealing with a settler colonialism that has to be confronted and have to be confronted structurally.
And do you think that part of what you seem to be saying is the issue of responsibility for what's happening today? And you started with the British mandate and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So you almost seem to be saying that part of the responsibility of what's happening today lies outside of Jews or Muslims or anybody. It's about the colonial powers that created this and are still responsible for it in many ways. Is that part of the lesson?
Yes, but also at the same, I didn't have, this is not the work, but I also problematize Palestinian leadership and Arab leadership. So I don't absolve the indigenous populations and some of the problems that are there. However, I think the British, the French, the so-called international community bear this really considerable responsibility. The maps that we see around the world, these are colonial maps. So when the whole discussion, let's say when we had the Rwandan genocide, it's very easy to say these are blacks that are killing one another. But how would the map that made minority-majority relations in Rwanda in such a way to maintain a structure where these political entities that are constructed will continue to have relations to the colonial motherland, that sells them weapons, that continue to teach them how to be civilized, and therefore the diamond industry and the raw materials that are driven from there are the cause for the genocide that takes place. But then we get a whole group from Geneva to try to investigate how the genocide takes place. Can we go back maybe 300 years to find actually how the genocide takes place, and instead of only looking like yesterday, as if these individuals have nothing to do and all of a sudden got up in the morning and say, you know what, I hate the Tutsis and I need to commit genocide. Rather, we look at the long durée and the structure that made it possible. We know this from, if you read Sylviana Diouf and really the literature on slavery, that the more demands for slaves increased in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, the more the intensification of the regional conflict in order to drive slaves to the coast. So the trade was guns for slaves. So we could see the intensification and the rapid collapse of the region as a result of this intensification. I would project today that we have oil for guns. The oil industry and the driving of oil resources from the Middle East, and still contest that term, and natural gas is driving the intensification of the conflict in there, and I think we need to look at it in that problematized lens.
And you also seem to be saying, and I'll open it up in a minute to the audience too, but you also seem to be saying that on the one hand, you seem to be rejecting the religious debate in many ways, or the religious explanation for the troubles, and you seem to be shifting that more to the economic or the territorial and economic and resources issues.
Manifest destiny, again, rationalizes a whole bunch of discourse. If God tells me to go and rob a bank, and you could put the religious text in there, how can you actually refuse that? Religion is used as an instrument to rationalize an already foregone conclusion. Mm-hmm. And I would say the colonial greed and the instrumentalization of a new mode of industrialization and a new mode of economy needed massive resources to be captured. And if you could put a God, what you call umbrella over it, it becomes part of rationalization for the citizenry of the colonial motherland, because they have to resolve the contradiction of, on the one hand, having a religious ideals, on the other hand, going and robbing and pillaging across the world. And one way to say it, that we're civilizing these populations, we're bringing God to them. At least if they die, at least they'll go to heaven. But in the meantime, let's take their gold. So again, for me, God is brought as a rationalization. That doesn't mean that some people's notion of God can actually go into using a religious rationalization for discourse. What I see is the British conduct was detrimentally carried out as part of a colonial strategy, and the more that oil was being discovered in the new region, the more it's accelerated attempt to have domination and control, and using buffer states, creating new elites that can overlook these interests that were expanding and covering much of the globe. So I think we have to de-link this attempt to constantly rationalize these discourses from religious perspective, which tends to actually almost get people to disrupt their thinking process about what are the stimuli that are generating and bringing these conflicts into perspective.
I'm going to open it up for questions. If any of you have any questions, please come up to the microphone here, and you can ask your questions. And also, Brother Haroon, if you're in the back, if you have any questions from online, please go ahead and listen. But let's go ahead with the question here first, and then we'll see if there are any more coming in.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hatem. First of all, thank you for your wonderful and insightful presentation. So my question is, it seems that the Zionist enterprise began as a colonial project that was bolstered by what was then the British Empire. But there was a shift. So could you speak a little about what led to and how the United States kind of inherited that role of supporting and championing the what is this colonial project, I guess?
Well, as the British lost their power and they became a shadow of their past, the United States ascended into power and became the dominant global power post-1945. And the Zionists began to shift their emphasis. They had long relations in the United States. We know from the discussions and debate, there were many iterations of the Balfour Declaration where U.S. Jewish leadership was engaged in the editing and in the framing of the Balfour Declaration. And the last sentence in there, that nothing will be done in relations to the right of Jewish populations in other countries, that was specifically about the Jewish population in the United States. So the shift toward the United States, again, is a result of the shift post-Second World War. And as the United States began to take its strategy to confront the Soviet Union, Israel became an important ally or an important state as a client state in the Cold War. And in essence, literally from the 60s onward, Israel became that instrumental state in the U.S. arsenal. And today we have another shift where Israel is being a frontline state in the war on terrorism. That's why many of our police departments are trained by Israel, the counterterrorism projects, all that is linked to Israeli framing. So there's a shift that we could also notice post 9/11 relative to Israel's role in a unipolar world where the United States have many options. Israel attempts to centralize its role as an important ally in this discussion.
Go ahead, we have another question, go ahead.
Two quick questions. The first one is there's one wave of Israeli propaganda to normalize settler colonialism and to frame it as something, not that it's not bad, but to frame it in a way that they're able to reply to these settler colonial claims by accepting it. And the other question was, when it comes to Palestinian self-determination and decolonization, how do you avoid establishing the same structures the colonial and the empire uses to colonize people and establish more just forms such as, let's say, anarchism?
A what?
Anarchism.
Anarchism, okay. Anarchism as a word in Berkeley is highly celebrated. So again, there has to be also a distinction between a colonial project and a decolonial or a response to colonialism. We cannot flatten the surface essentially as a way, well, we're worried about colonization and we're worried about the Zionist colonial project, therefore we have to worry about the Palestinians replicating the colonial project. That does not mean that I'm not concerned about what decolonization means. We still have to contend with what does decolonization look like. Is it possible? Is it feasible? What are the constituent elements? And how to make that possibility occur at least in the distant future, if not the more immediate future. I tend to believe that if we have 12.6 million people, it will be insane for anyone to think that they could eliminate the other. Right? This notion, and I know in certain neighborhoods, possibly right outside 7-Eleven, it might appeal to you, but to put any type of concept that you could actually get rid of one side or one part of the population as a way to achieve what you call a Puritan state, that is a figment of somebody's imagination that cannot be actualized nor should be actually asserted. However, that does not mean that we accept the status quo. We have to challenge ourselves to reach into a decolonization. Therefore, for me, Israel and Zionism has to contend with what does decolonization mean for the Jewish person who emerged into modernity by being wedded into the land and thinking that's what the meaning of being Jewish in the modern age. That question has to be contended with and has to be emerged. For the Palestinians also, our effort is not to replicate and create another post-colonial state like some of the other states that have emerged from post-coloniality, which essentially replicates a post-colonial distorted notions. And unfortunately, some of our political processes under the Palestinian Authority does not give us much hope at the present that what might emerge will be something different than the post-colonial structure that has been in existence across many parts of the Southern Hemisphere.
Do we have a question in the back?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is specifically about this thing that you were just speaking to right now, the like desire of Zionism to contend with modernity and how it uses territory as a way to emerge into it. I'm just struggling to understand what that means. Like, what role does territory play in constituting a modern Jewish or other human?
There's a statement I quote in my book. It says, not by the book Zion risen, but rather by the sword and might that Zion arose. And therefore, the modern Jewish person, in relations to Zionism, had to conceptualize that a new Jewish person needs to emerge into modernity by having total control of their destiny and not waiting for the Messiah or waiting for God to uplift and change the condition. That resulted for the Zionist project, said essentially for that modern Jewish person to emerge, it needs to have matrimony with the land. So it, in essence, becomes, it's not the religious text that is the foundation of modern Zionism. It's actually basic European nationalism wedded into power, and a modern Jewish person in the Zionist form emerges in Palestine. Now, how that can be de-aggregated is the major challenge, especially when you have 500 nuclear weapons and you think that you could force your will not only on the Palestinians, but on the region as a whole. And my sense is that if you think that power itself is an enough ingredient to guarantee sustainability and longevity, then you haven't read history. As again, just down the street, there's something called the pyramids, and the pharaoh is not there. He was vested in power, and therefore history is an apt lesson that power itself as an ingredient is not sufficient. So in giving birth to the modern Jewish person, right, in the guise of Zionism, I think they committed a major error by replicating and thinking that their destiny could be successful by replicating European modality in relations to a particular notion of nationalism, and then also connecting themselves to a major power. It's interestingly enough, in Jabotinsky's writing, he says that we need to have an external power to continue to support us. So what is the meaning of Jewish national liberation if you are constantly actually needing an external power to support you that itself have historically continuously been almost anti-Semitic in its discourses? So that raises the question, what type of independence it is, or national liberation, if it continues to be dependent on the major European powers in the past and the United States in the present. And I know for a fact both have not engaged with the Jewish population out of love or concern for them. They're there for their national interests, and I think that should be, in essence, the wake-up call for a decolonized mindset moving forward.
Go ahead, Haram.
Ahmed asks online, are there any important examples in history of populations overcoming settler colonialism? If so, which strategies from such examples can supporters of Palestine act on as well?
Well, in using settler colonialism, I think the closest example would be South Africa. That would be the closest example. But again, in here, possibly the demographic issue between majority black and a minority white might be different, but similarity does not mean that it has to be identical. So South Africa might be the modality that could be thought of as something that the Palestinians and also the Jewish population can look at. Is it doable? Again, that is a fundamental question for us to think about and to contemplate. Can we commit ourselves to a prolonged military conflict in relations to the Palestinian struggle? Again, we've been at it, at least the Palestinians, for 70 years, and then on top of that, another 30 years with confronting and challenging the British. The example of South Africa provide the reconciliation, but again, from our South African colleagues, they'll tell us that the reconciliation did not really end the colonial project itself, because it was a political accommodation on the one hand that the black Africans of South Africa got to take possession of the political system, but the economy continued to be in the hands of the whites. And as such, this is the tension that we see. And then corruption seeped in, because if you don't have the financial resources and the economy, it's very easy to actually derail the economic structure, even though that you might control the majority of the political structure. And we don't need to go to South Africa to realize the pernicious role that wealth and money plays in our own political structure. We have the best democracy that money can buy, and I don't have a lot of money to buy as much democracy as I want in this country. So that's the challenge at this time.
Let me follow up real quickly on that question, though. The idea of South Africa being the sort of model for,
As a possible, the settler colonialism
Right.
having a possibility of ending a settler colonial project.
Right, so what lesson do you take from South Africa what was it actually? What are the key elements that you feel overturned apartheid, that got rid of it?
Well, I think internally there were mass mobilization in South Africa. Remember that Nelson Mandela was sent to jail in 1964. Right? And prior to that, again, from 1948 to 1964, South African blacks were struggling against the newly developed or newly articulated apartheid rule. Prior to that, there also were another 50 years of struggle against the settler colonialism in South Africa. And as you hit into the 1960s and 70s, we have to put that struggle of South Africa into the broader arena of the non-aligned movement, the anti-colonial struggles that were successful in Algeria, successful in Vietnam, in other places, that coalesced around the support internally for the South African movement. Now, just to remind people, the Palestinians were intimately connected to the South African struggle. For those who don't know, it was the Palestinians who provided the military training for the military wing of the ANC, and they were trained by the Palestinians in both Algeria, in Libya, as well as helping them in Mozambique. And for a long period of time, and this is only to assert the fact and just to point historical fact, when Nelson Mandela was in jail, it was the Palestinians, the PLO at the time, that actually provided the financing for his family throughout his years in jail. All right, so that's a fact in relation to that South Africa. And when Nelson Mandela was released, if you remember, Ted Koppel had the audacity in his interview in New York to ask him to condemn Yasser Arafat at the time. And again, Nelson Mandela, being the magnanimous person, he says to Ted Koppel, "You don't tell us who our friends are." Again, the Palestinians been there for the long period of time. Externally, the anti-apartheid movement was very successful in putting pressure on the South African white apartheid government. And the economic boycott movement on college campuses. I remember for a long period of time we managed to have, at the time, I was part of the anti-apartheid committee here in the United States. We actually managed to remove Coca-Cola company from across the campuses nationally. And actually the tipping point is when Pepsi began to send their application for campuses to say that we are socially responsible, we're not in South Africa. That's a tipping point, because now you have a multinational corporations becoming the advocate for your cause. I no longer needed to speak in support of South Africa. Pepsi is actually speaking for us, because they realized they were not in South Africa, and Coca-Cola was in South Africa. Then Coca-Cola came back and saying, we're going to give the concession in South Africa to a black South African and move it to one of the homelands. This is added insult to injury, because again, the South Africa apartheid regime have created homelands that were basically they were the only ones who were recognizing these homelands in Bantustan, and that added even more pressure for the success of this divestment movement relative to South Africa. That made the tipping point. South Africa could not participate in athletic competition because people would not engage in competition with South Africa. Musicians, especially when they had this Sun City that they were developing in South Africa, a whole enterprise for tourists, and they wanted musicians to actually perform in there. There was a pressure on musicians to boycott performing in South Africa, and again, musicians responded. So essentially that isolation internationally with the mass political mobilization internally made it possible. What I don't want people to think, and this is something, again, in some parts of Berkeley and other, they think that the divestment movement is what made the South Africa struggle successful. It helped, but the people in South Africa are the ones that actually succeeded in undoing apartheid and struggled mightily in order for them to reverse. And I think the Palestinians will be able to do that. And I'm hoping that it will be a peaceful way for us to engage and get a period where we are able to free ourselves from settler colonialism.
Question from Harun, go ahead, from online.
Okay, Ustaz Abdullah asks, you mentioned, and I think you actually just touched on some of this, but you mentioned that the two-state solution seems to no longer be possible. Does that also mean that you believe that there is no longer anything practical that people can do to pressure the Zionist regime to give Palestinians their full civil rights? Is BDS still effective in your view in light of this new posture of AIPAC and the incoming presidency?
Again, the two-state solution for all intensive purposes is gone. The West Bank has already been devoured by settlements. Almost 60% of the West Bank either is subject to settlements, natural reserves, military areas, security areas, development zone, and so on. So the two-state framing essentially is no longer viable. What you have is a Swiss cheese, and it's actually a Swiss cheese with more open space for any political possibilities to occur. So that's in there. Now, does that mean that Palestinians can ask for civil rights? And I think part of demanding, at least for the PDS movement, there are certain demands that are articulated in here. It does not attach itself to a two-state solution, and I think in this sense is making a different framing relative to the PDS and some of the demands in there. Could it be possible that Palestinians can actually launch a campaign to say one person, one vote, and equality for all? I think that possibly would be a campaign that would basically garner some support both here as well as in Palestine, considering all the transformation that has occurred. And I think there are some people that are calling on the framing of a one-state solution, a democratic state that has specific attention to the religious complexities of the population there, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, and reach a level of possibility of such a state that with equal standing for everyone there. So that seems to be some of those who are thinking in those terms are asserting and calling for that.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to bring it back down to our sort of a personal level, if you will, for all of us who are listening here in the audience and online. How and what advice would you have? How do we begin to affect anything? What can we as individuals do, and both organized and, but also on our own basis and as individuals do? What advice would you have to help us, work towards a solution for this?
All politics is local. Right? So all politics is local. So again, the Palestinians actually have called for a PDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction. So you need, if you want to express solidarity with the Palestinians as well as engage in work relative to the Palestinians, then you have at least to take some steps to actualize that solidarity with supporting the PDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction. This also requires that we have an assault on the PDS movement and spokespeople and canvases to silence them. We had a state bill that was passed here in Sacramento that essentially, for all intensive purposes, want to criminalize advocacy and speaking for the PDS movement. And just yesterday, another bill that was introduced in the Senate that under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, which is a legitimate area to engage in fighting against anti-Semitism, but embedded in the bill is actually any aspect of work that delegitimize Israel, which essentially targeting the PDS movement. That was a major debate in the Democratic platform period, as well as in the Democratic Party. there has to be a way for us to express that solidarity in real ways, in particular to support those who are speaking on PDS in the United States, especially on college campuses where students have been criminalized, have been targeted, and have been essentially inferiorized relative to their work in relations to Palestine. And you don't need to go far to any of the campuses around. You just go across the street at UC Berkeley. The students who were engaged in the decal course, Palestine, had to face the structural erasure of Palestine and what I call is the academic checkpoints, where a particular notion, an engagement of Palestine has to be understood, and the campuses act if they are a front desk of the State Department. And therefore, they regulate the conceptualization of how Palestine is engaged in, and such that would be how to express that support and that solidarity at the local level. On the individual level, individually, you have to be a conscious person in terms of your choices of what you purchase and what you buy, and to make sure that you are not contributing in any way, small or large, to supporting Israel apartheid and the structure that is unfolding, and therefore have to be a conscious person and conscious shopper. I know a lot of people will go and let's say to even some Middle Eastern markets, and you'll find the shelves filled with made in Israel products, and some of these are made in settlements as well. So you have to be a conscious shopper not to buy them, but I also take the next step to actually complain to the person or to the owner or to the cashier, say, I am not a person that can come back to shop in here because you are actually carrying products that at the end of the day undermines and contribute to the continuation of dispossession of the Palestinians. Now, increasingly, some of the sophisticated campaigns against the PDS movement is actually trying to link Palestinian economy and investment into the Israelis. So actually they're coming back at you and says, well, these actually benefit the Palestinians because they are employed in there. And I remind people that that same framing was given to us during the anti-apartheid movement. I remember when we had the campaign again, the pro-apartheid were actually going and panning around the United States saying that this would hurt black South Africans. And at the time, we checked with the ANC in New York office to say, what is your position on this boycott divestment movement or the anti-apartheid movement and the divestment? And the ANC actually explicitly said, we actually support boycott, even if it hurts the black Africans in the short run. This is a pain and suffering that is for the future horizon of our people. And as such, the more sophisticated right now are sending that this is actually employs Palestinians and so on, and that should not be used as a legitimate framing in order to dispense with people supporting the PDS movement. And I think that's on a local level of what you need to engage in.
One quick thing on the BDS movement, Dr. Hatem. Are you concerned at all that there's been some, obviously, within the people who support the Palestinian cause, who want to see peace there, there still seems to be a wedge driven between them because of the BDS movement, the people who are taking both sides. I mean, even in the Muslim community, you have that. Are you concerned at all that that's hurting the larger issue, the larger cause, or do you think this is, how do you see it playing out?
Well, again, we are playing, or the field in relations to Palestine is a very treacherous terrain. Mm-hmm. And I know some of the groups that are engaging in trying to derail the Palestinian effort are engaging 24/7. So, for example, I've written extensively on the MLI program, right, the Hartman Institute, the Muslim Leadership Initiative. And some of the participants came back basically saying, well, we will support the Palestinians, but we can't engage in the PDS. And let me raise the question that, during the anti-apartheid movement, the US government had a project or a program called constructive engagement. And they actually were inviting activists to go and visit South Africa and engage the South African whites and sit in dialogues. And there was a major figure in South Africa that was against the anti-apartheid movement, against the ANC, Chief Buthelezi.
Right.
So that we were asked to engage, and they would bring tours in the United States by individuals that are affiliated with this to say that we have a different way to solve it. We could actually reach and communicate with each other and solve it, and you should not support the anti-apartheid movement in the time. And that same framing is being constructed. So the MLI is taking Muslim leaders in here and taking them to look and examine and engage in Palestine, in particular in Jerusalem, coming as a VIPs and going into an occupied area without actually having any invitation from the Palestinians themselves. I think there has to be a principled ethical position. If there is an occupied people, the principled position is that if you want to engage, you should check with the people who are occupied, as a just basic principle. And also to say, how can I help you, or how I can be in solidarity with you, as another principle. Mm-hmm. You can't actually say, well, you know, I want to be in solidarity with you, but I'll tell you what my solidarity with you and what you're doing is unacceptable to me. That's not solidarity, that's what I call utilization. If you want to craft your own access in the United States, I say, please don't use the Palestinians as the bridge to negotiate your access in the US political landscape, social, economic landscape. We have enough political machination occurring in Palestine without having to use interfaith, or what we call faith washing, as a way to engage with Palestine, where you could pick and choose because you feel that your access in the US is contingent in playing these games. Now, just today I put out my article on a whole other host of issues relative to AJC, the American Jewish Committee, which has engaged the Arab Muslim population. They're creating this Jewish Muslim advisory board under the guise of trying to challenge or confront anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism, and two other goals, which is laudable and so on. But the AJC itself has been in the forefront of producing and promoting Islamophobia. They promoted Daniel Pye's book, Steve Emerson's book, Pamela Geller, and a whole of hosts, and they actually gave him award, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and you name it. So for me, if you want to deal with Islamophobia, which is important, you cannot separate and make justice divisible. That I could be for justice in this neighborhood, but I will not be for justice in this neighborhood. Justice is indivisible, and you have to be consistent. Justice at the local and justice on the transnational. Does not mean that you have to be constantly in the front line, but you have to act from an ethical, moral position, and that ethical, moral position has to be consistent across the board. And I think that framing that is occurring in there is very problematic, and some of the which, again, is instrumentalized in the sense to try to draw this wedge. And increasingly in the United States, Muslim access is being governed by keeping Palestine on the front door. That don't bring Palestine because it complicates your attempt to be, quote unquote, allowed and integrated into the broader society. So there is a price to pay, and the price is Palestine on the side of your dish.
The BDS, so you see BDS more than just a tactical issue. It's more central to you in the struggle than just one of many tactics.
It's one of many tactics, but it's very significant because this is 700
Right.
plus Palestinian civil society organization saying that this is what solidarity and this is what we want of you to express. And this crosses both Muslim, Christian, organizations in Palestine that are framing their desires and their understanding of what they are calling for. And as such, there has to be a recognition of what the Palestinians call for solidarity with them, which is the PDS movement. There are other strategies that covers the full spectrum, but again, today the leading edge of Palestine work on a global level is the PDS movement. And I think it's very important and significant. Again, another side issue, some of the early research on the PDS actually came from our South African allies. that they did the research, like 800-page research on PDS and strategy and so on that was developed by the South African activists in essentially expression of solidarity with the Palestinians because of the long history between them. So again, we're not dealing with that all of a sudden these Palestinians just sitting on the corner and not aware of their own historical centrality as well as the broader movement around the globe. So I think if Muslims, Arab, Palestinians think that their future horizon politically in the United States is to be disconnected from an affirmation of Palestine, then I would say they are not recognizing the centrality and the importance of Palestine in the larger discourse. This should not also, because I'm just trying to connect many dots in here, this does not mean that the only concern of the Muslims is only Palestine, because there is a tension that develops that if you're engaged in Palestine, that you're all of a sudden not concerned about the domestic situation that was taking place here in the United States. I say being for Palestine and PDS is as important as being behind and support of the struggle of African Americans in this country and their struggle continuously to stop the violence that is committed against them. And it's not surprising that the police force that is trained by Israeli security forces are being militarized on the front line. And as such, there has to be that connection between the struggles abroad and the struggle here to be that justice is indivisible, and there has to be consistency in taking the moral, ethical stand, which is difficult. You might not be invited to some, quote, polite company. You might not be, getting into these dinner and iftars that are invited, but that's the price that somebody who's ethical and moral in standing on issues of the time. Right? So I think that's what the call for people to engage in the PDS movement at this present time.
On that note, we've come to the end. Haroon? One quick question. All right, last one.
Yes, this is a quick one. Thank you. Someone is simply asking, in addition to your new book, Dr. Hatem, could you recommend one or two other books that would help us to speak intelligently about this issue?
Well, anything that is written by Edward Said, so the Palestine Question by Edward Said, Ilan Pape is very important work. Noor Masalha has done great work. I think there's 3 or 4 books of Noor Masalha, hands down some of the really good work on the Palestine question and the understanding of various parts of Palestine. So those are highly recommended. If you have the ability to also maybe access Walid al-Khalidi, From Haven to Conquest, is a solid book. It's substantial. You could actually get it at the Palestine Institute website. They have a sale on it right now. I don't get commission, but you could get some good materials on this.
Could you think about possibly putting up a list on your website?
Actually, I have a list on myacademia.edu. So if you access, I have an extensive list on Palestine. I think 49 works. But I'll also post it. I'll ask for it to be posted tomorrow on my own website. So you'll have some of the key works on Palestine that should be accessible.
Inshallah. On that note, can you please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Hatem?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.